Maya's life was a mosaic of quiet monotony, her days marked by routines that rarely varied. At 38 years old, she lived in a spacious house in the suburbs, filled with light but increasingly devoid of warmth. Her husband, Benjamin, a successful businessman, was always busy jetting off to meetings, attending conferences, and responding to endless emails. His presence at home was fleeting, a series of hurried goodbyes and promises to make time. Sunday, Mia had long since learned to adapt to his absence. She focused on maintaining the house, tending to the garden, and indulging in hobbies like reading or painting, but no amount of distraction could fill the growing void in her heart. The silence of the house pressed in on her like an invisible weight, amplifying her feelings of isolation. Their son, Alexander, had been a source of joy in her life, though even that had changed in recent years. At 20, Alexander was no longer the boy who eagerly sought her attention. After dropping out of college 2 years ago, he worked part time at a nearby grocery store. Though they shared the same roof, their interactions had become sparse, a reflection of his growing independence. One sweltering summer day, as Benjamin prepared for yet another business trip, Mia stood by the kitchen counter, watching him pack. "I'll be back by Friday," he said, his tone brisk as he stuffed papers into his briefcase. "Of course," Mia replied, her voice subdued. She knew the script by heart. After Benjamin left, the house seemed larger and quieter than ever. Maya went about her day, tidying up and watering the plants. By noon, the heat outside was oppressive, and she retreated to the living room, hoping to lose herself in a novel. It was around this time that Alexander returned from his shift, his t-shirt damp with sweat. "It's unbearable out there," he muttered, tossing his bag onto the counter. Mia looked up, then smiled faintly. "There's lemonade in the fridge," she offered. Alexander poured himself a glass and sat across from her, the ceiling fan doing little to alleviate the heat. They exchanged a few words about his day before falling into a comfortable silence. Yet, as Maya watched him, she felt a strange pang of nostalgia. He was no longer the little boy who used to cling to her skirts, but a young man with a quiet confidence that seemed to have sprung up overnight. Later that afternoon, as Mia moved through the hallway, she passed the bathroom and noticed the door was slightly ajar. The sound of running water reached her ears, and she paused for a moment, lost in thought. But as she glanced through the small gap, she caught a fleeting glimpse of Alexander under the shower. Her breath hitched, and she quickly stepped back, her heart racing. The moment was brief, accidental, and deeply unsettling. She retreated to the living room, her mind in turmoil. "What is wrong with me?" she thought, her cheeks burning with shame. But no matter how much she tried to push it away, the image lingered, unsettling her in ways she couldn't understand. In the days that followed, Maya tried to convince herself that nothing had changed. She focused on her routines, determined to bury the strange emotions that had surfaced. Yet every interaction with Alexander seemed to magnify her unease. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Alexander looked at her curiously. "You've been quiet lately, Mom? Everything okay?" Mia forced a smile, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her glass. "I'm fine, just tired." Alexander studied her for a moment before nodding, but his gaze lingered. It was as though he could sense the unspoken tension between them, even if he didn't fully understand it. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Maya found herself avoiding Alexander, retreating to her room, or staying out longer than usual. But the more she distanced herself, the more isolated she felt. Meanwhile, Alexander's behavior began to shift in subtle ways. He lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, asked more questions about her day, and occasionally touched her arm or shoulder in ways that felt too deliberate to be accidental. Maya told herself she was imagining things, that her own guilt was distorting her perception. One particularly hot afternoon, Maya decided to cool off in the backyard pool. As she floated on the water, the sound of footsteps caught her attention. She glanced up to see Alexander standing by the edge, watching her with an unreadable expression. Mind if I join? He asked, a playful grin on his face. Mia hesitated but nodded, trying to keep her tone light. Of course not. As Alexander dove into the water, Mia felt her chest tighten. The proximity, the casual ease with which he interacted with her, all of it felt wrong. Yet she couldn't bring herself to leave. Later, as they sat by the pool, Alexander turned to her, his expression serious. Mom, can I ask you something? Maya's stomach twisted. What is it? Do you ever feel lonely? He asked, his voice quiet. The question caught her off guard. She looked away, her heart pounding. Everyone feels lonely sometimes, she replied carefully. Alexander nodded, his gaze fixed on the water. I don't want you to feel that way. I care about you, Mom, a lot. The words, though innocent on the surface, carried a weight that made Maya's breath catch. She stood abruptly, mumbling an excuse about needing to check on dinner. In the safety of the kitchen, she leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge. But walls seemed to close in on her as she struggled to make sense of her emotions. Mia's resolve to maintain distance crumbled as the days turned into weeks. Alexander's presence was inescapable, his behavior growing increasingly bold. One evening, as they watched a movie together, their hands brushed accidentally. Maya pulled hers away quickly, but Alexander didn't. Mom, he said softly, his eyes searching hers. Can we talk? Mia hesitated, her pulse quickening. About what? About us? He replied, his voice steady. Her heart sank. There's nothing to talk about, she said, standing up abruptly. I think it's time for bed, but Alexander didn't let it go. The next morning, he approached her in the kitchen, his expression earnest. Mom, I know you feel it too, he said, his tone a mix of vulnerability and determination. Mia froze, her mind racing. Her mind racing. Feel what? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Alexander stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. This connection, it's more than just mother and son. I can't stop thinking about you. The air between them felt electric, charged with emotions neither of them could name. Mia shook her head, her voice trembling. This is wrong, Alexander. We can't do this. But her words lacked conviction, and Alexander saw it. He reached for her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. Mom, I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia pulled away, tears streaming down her face. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. If this continues, we'll destroy everything. But despite her words, the boundary between them had already blurred. Every interaction became fraught with tension, every glance a silent acknowledgement of what they couldn't say aloud. The turning point came one evening when Benjamin announced he would be coming home early. Panic set in as Mia realized the fragile equilibrium she had been maintaining was about to collapse. When Benjamin walked through the door, the tension in the house was palpable. He noticed immediately, his sharp eyes flicking between Mia and Alexander. Is something going on? He asked, his tone light but probing. Mia forced a laugh, shaking her head. No, nothing at all. But the cracks in her facade were obvious, and Benjamin's suspicion only grew. As the days passed, the weight of their secret threatened to crush Mia. She knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. This sets the stage for the climax in Part 4, where the escalating tension reaches a breaking point. The characters' emotions, actions, and choices remain consistent and logically developed, building toward an inevitable confrontation. The fragile web of secrets that Mia and Alexander had woven was beginning to unravel. Benjamin, observant as always, noticed the strained dynamics in the house. He couldn't quite place what was wrong, but the tension was palpable and it gnawed at him. One evening, while Mina was preparing dinner, Benjamin entered the kitchen, his face a mask of feigned nonchalance. You've been quiet lately, he remarked, leaning against the counter. Is everything okay? Mia's hands froze mid-chop. She avoided his gaze, focusing intently on the vegetables in front of her. Just tired, she replied. Benjamin studied her for a moment before nodding, but his unease didn't dissipate. The turning point came a few nights later. Benjamin returned home earlier than expected from a meeting and found Maya and Alexander in the living room. They weren't doing anything overtly suspicious, but the air between them was thick with an unspoken tension. Benjamin's sharp eyes flicked between them, his suspicion deepening. I interrupting something? He asked, his tone light but probing. Mia laughed nervously. Of course not. We were just watching TV, but Benjamin wasn't convinced. His gaze lingered on Alexander, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The atmosphere in the room became suffocating, and Maya felt the walls closing in. That night, as Benjamin lay beside her in bed, he broke the silence. Ah, Maya, he said quietly, I feel like you're hiding something from me. Maya's heart pounded. She turned to face him, forcing a confused expression. What are you talking about? He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. I don't know. It's just a feeling. But something's not right. Mia felt the weight of his words like a stone in her chest. She knew she couldn't keep this charade up much longer. The tension was tearing her apart, and the risk of discovery loomed larger every day. The breaking point came the next evening. Benjamin confronted Alexander directly while Maya was in the kitchen. Is there something going on between you and your mother? He asked bluntly. Alexander froze, his face pale. What? Of course not, Dad. Why would you even think that? Benjamin narrowed his eyes. I don't know. But the way you two have been acting lately, it doesn't sit right with me. Maya walked in just as Alexander was stammering out a denial. She felt the blood drain from her face as Benjamin turned to her, his expression a mix of anger and hurt. Is there something you want to tell me, Mia? He asked, his voice cold. Mia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence stretched between them, heavy and damning. That night, Mia made the hardest decision of her life. She knew that the only way to save her family was to put an end to the relationship with Alexander. The realization filled her with both relief and sorrow, but it was a choice she knew she had to make. She called Alexander to the porch late that evening. The moon cast a soft glow on his face as he sat across from her, his expression filled with apprehension. Alexander, Mia began, her voice trembling. Her voice trembling. We need to talk? He nodded, his eyes searching hers. I know what you're going to say, he said quietly. Tears welled in Mia's eyes as she reached for his hand. I love you, Alexander, but what's happening between us, it can't continue. It's wrong, and it's tearing our family apart. Alexander looked down, his jaw clenched. I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not losing me, Mia said, her voice breaking. But we need to go back to being mother and son. It's the only way to make things right. The pain in Alexander's eyes was almost too much for Mia to bear. But he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Okay, Mom, he said, I understand. The decision was final, but it left both of them shattered. Alexander retreated to his room, and Maya spent the night crying in silence, her heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. The following day, Alexander packed a bag and left the house, telling Benjamin that he needed some time to clear his head. Benjamin didn't press him for details, but his suspicions lingered. With Alexander gone, the house felt emptier than ever. Maya threw herself into repairing her relationship with Benjamin, determined to rebuild the trust she had almost destroyed. She began to spend more time with him, asking about his work and joining him on weekend trips, but the guilt lingered. Maya couldn't erase the memories of what had happened, nor could she fully forgive herself. She began seeing a therapist, hoping to understand the emotions that had led her down such a dangerous path. Through therapy, she learned to confront her feelings of loneliness and inadequacy, recognizing how they had fueled her actions. Alexander, meanwhile, moved to a neighboring town and started a new job. He called occasionally to check in, but their conversations were brief and formal. Maya missed him terribly, but knew that the distance was necessary for both of them to heal. Over time, the cracks in Mia and Benjamin's marriage began to mend. They started attending couples counseling where they addressed the underlying issues that had driven them apart. For the first time in years, they began to communicate openly and honestly, rebuilding the foundation of their relationship. Months passed, and the pain of what had happened began to fade. Maya and Alexander found a new normal, one built on respect and boundaries. Though their bond would never be the same, they both understood that their choices had been a necessary step toward healing. In her journal, Mia wrote, "Loneliness is a powerful force. It can drive you to seek connection in places you never imagined, to cross lines you thought were unbreakable. But in the end, it's love, the pure, selfless kind that brings you back to yourself. I've learned that to truly love someone, you have to let go of what's wrong and fight for what's right." That's what I've done, and it's what I'll continue to do as the seasons changed. So did Mia's perspective. She no longer saw her past as a source of shame, but as a lesson, a painful reminder of the importance of boundaries, honesty, and self awareness. Her family was not perfect, but it was healing. And for the first time in years, Mia felt a sense of peace.